Hi, everyone. Welcome to the show. I'm Tasha Simms.
And I'm Mark Curran.
And you're listening to Conscious Living Radio, Co-op Radio in Vancouver, 100.5 FM. Today's show, super excited. We're talking about incorporating the use of psychedelics in the therapeutic process. How come it's effective? What's the approach? And for people who are called to work in this way, is there a training, which there is? But we're also going to look at research on the brain and how the brain can explain why we're so caught up and why it's so difficult to stop repetitive, painful behaviors. Our guest is Todd Ritchey. He's an expert in the field of addiction treatment, and for the past 20 years has used his neuroscience-based model to help thousands of people get free from dysfunctional patterns and live healthy, happy lives. He believes we all struggle with addiction, that we are biochemically addicted to repeat certain unhelpful behaviors and also able to create new pathways out of our painful states. Todd developed the Answer Model Therapy, a unified understanding of human behavior through the discovery of a core mechanism in the brain that's now licensed by the boards of marriage and family counselors in California, New Mexico, Arizona, and Nevada. So we're going to find out more about Todd's approach and, as I mentioned, the incorporation of psychedelics and the program that he's designed to train people to support their own clients through a psychedelic experience. Welcome to the show, Todd.
I'm excited to be here. Thanks, Tasha.
Me too.
And Mark.
I love what you said. So in your model, you refer to anything that we do repeatedly, a behavior, an emotion, a substance, an identity, or a belief that causes ourselves or another pain as addiction. And I don't think I've ever gone down that road so clearly. So tell us more about that.
Yeah. Well, first of all, we struggle with the word addiction. We wish we could come up with another word because the word is stigmatized. Mm-hmm. And yet, in terms of describing the specific mechanisms in the brain that are actually happening to the brain and the body, what we decided to do is try and take away the stigma from the word addiction and hang on to the word because it's the only thing that accurately really describes what's happening. And it sounds a little bit bombastic, and maybe even on the surface, it sounds a little simplistic, because here we are saying, like, think about this, literally, the vast majority of any type of chronic or repetitive pattern of pain, that means physical pain. For example, I fell 45 feet off a roof when I was 29 years old. And I broke my back and I've got a new ankle. And so even physical pain like that, if it becomes chronic or repetitive, I walked into the surgeon's office and he said to me, "Your doctors must have made a mistake. There's nothing on here for pain management." And I said, "That's because I don't really have any chronic pain. Like if I go for a 10K walk, yeah, I might have a little bit of pain, but generally it's just not there." He goes, no, let me show you. And he puts the slides up in the light board. And he says, "This is like some of the worst arthritis we've ever seen. And these granules in between your joint here, they're trying to fuse the joint together. It's like, you can't walk on this." And I said, "Well, you saw me walk in, doc." And then I went on to make the mistake of saying, "Well, I don't really believe in chronic or repetitive patterns of pain in most cases. I think it's addiction." And then he took the slides off the board. He put them back in the manila envelope. And I'll never forget this. He threw the envelope on the desk and he goes, "Whatever floats your boat," and walks out of the room.
I think I know that doctor.
You might. So, it's really hard to wrap your head around it. And I don't know that your jaw hits the floor when you hear it, because I just think that maybe you can't believe it. It simplifies all forms of dysfunction. So that means that if your OCD leads to pain, if your ADHD leads to pain, if your schizophrenia leads to pain and it's chronic or repetitive in nature, there's a mechanism in the brain that's actually perpetuating and driving that.
And we're going to throw in drinking, drugs, overeating,
that's right.
Depression.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's get to it, because that does sound, I love that it's so encompassing. There's something to me about the simplicity of that. We haven't gotten to the how to create new pathways, but let's talk about what's going on in the brain when any of those under that umbrella, what's happening?
Yeah, I mean, it's a complex thing. And what I'll do is try and simplify it down to a couple different chemicals that are sort of mediating human behavior. And so first you have to understand that one of our sort of big discoveries we suggest is that people, first of all, literally get biochemically addicted to pain. So at first blush, that seems counterintuitive, because if you understand an evolutionary model, certainly being addicted to pain wouldn't serve evolution. It wouldn't serve survival on any level. And so when you do the anthropological work and what you recognize is, even today in hunter-gatherer bands, this doesn't apply to them. It just applies to humans in a modern culture. And so what an anthropologist might call that is evolutionary mismatch. And that evolutionary mismatch means that we are 99-point-something% hunter-gatherer physiology living in a modern culture that we haven't adapted to yet. And so there have been some mutations and adaptations over the last 10, 12, 15,000 years or so. Things, for example, like our ability to digest milk or animal milk, or our ability to digest grains. These are not sort of normal things for hunter-gatherers. Hunter-gatherers didn't use dairy, and they didn't use grains. And so once we shifted to an agrarian culture, that's when these changes started taking place. So what actually happens in the brain? I sort of simplify this. I call it a 10 times 2 times. So in a modern culture, or let's go back to hunter-gatherer culture, literally everything that you did that would enhance the probability of survival, that was essential for survival. So let's start with the pursuit of food, the pursuit of sex, socialization with the band, the members of the band, playfulness with abandon, communing with nature and connecting to nature and paying attention to nature, discovery of your abilities, passion, purpose, meaning, artistic expression, meaningful work, contribution to the band. All of these things are inherent in us. They're a part of our hardware. And all of those things are mediated and driven by 2 chemicals fundamentally. And the first one would be dopamine. Now, for the longest time, people thought maybe dopamine was more of a pleasure chemical. And it's intimately connected to pleasure chemicals, but it seems that the primary use or the primary purpose of dopamine is as a drive chemical, neurotransmitter. So dopamine is the thing that creates the hunger to motivate you to eat, and then activates the body in that direction. It creates the horny to motivate you to have sex and activates the body in that way. It creates the tired and motivates you to sleep. It creates all of the socialization, all of these things that sort of feel non-homeostatic. And then the drive to get back into homeostasis somehow are driven by, first initially, by this dopamine. Now, that wouldn't be enough. We are sort of these biofeedback machines, and the biofeedback is a positive feedback. So first we're compelled to act towards things that enhance the probability of survival, and then that is reinforced by pleasure. So when I eat, it's delicious. When I have sex, it feels good. When I have a nap and I wake up, I feel great. When I play with my friends, it feels good. When I'm out in nature, there's this connection and all of these things are mediated and enhanced by and reinforced by beta endorphin. We've all heard of endorphin highs, but endorphins are our body's primary pleasure chemical. And so what happens in a modern culture, well, let's just stay with the hunter-gatherers. Initially then, so the dopamine would have you go do something, then you would do it, and the beta endorphin would go, this is good. Do more of that. That felt great. And so if you could imagine that you have a baseline, and then that baseline, let's say approximately, that baseline would be doubled. You'd get 2 times the amount of dopamine, and that would be enough to activate you and motivate you. And then you get 2 times the amount of beta endorphin. That would be enough for you to feel some real sense of pleasure related to that activity. And again, all serving survival, enhancing the probability of survival. Well, the problem in a modern culture is that beta endorphin is an opioid. Opioid, what does that mean? It's an internal version, it's an endogenous version, which we mean it's created in the brain and the body, it's created inside of us, of heroin. It's pure heroin. And also then it binds with the same receptor sites that heroin does, and we can build a tolerance and we can become addicted to it. Now, if we're just getting it in the doses of doubling 2 times and 2 times, 2 times dopamine, 2 times beta endorphin, our body evolved for millions of years to actually assimilate that, and that doesn't become a problem. Well, the other challenge is that and maybe this is a quirk of nature. I don't want to say God got it wrong somewhere, but this seems like, why would we put our esophagus right next to our trachea? It's like, that doesn't make sense. People are going to choke and suffocate. But in this case, beta endorphin also is our body's primary painkiller. The problem is that when we experience pain, we don't get 2 times. When we experience pain or extreme fear, we get from 5 to 10 times the amount of beta endorphin. Remember, heroin, 5 to 10 times. Now, in a hunter-gatherer culture,
that wasn't. Clarify one thing, but we don't go pleasant. Why is the experience one is pleasant, one is painful? Well,
because it's a subcortical process. We don't actually process it. We don't experience it as pleasant. In fact, we could talk a little bit about that, but it might take us down the rabbit hole a little bit. We would say that maybe psychopaths, to some degree sociopaths, have become aware of the pleasure related to their pursuit of pain. So they become aware of it. But most people are completely unaware of it. They just experience, here I am in pain, and now my pain is diminished. I don't experience the pleasure in that. Now, really astute observers of human behavior, even historically, like Shakespeare wrote some quote like, "Oh, such sweet sorrow." What does that mean? Oh, such sweet sorrow. Is it that I'm squeezing somehow the pleasure out of my pain in some way?
Like the blues, singing the blues.
You got it. You got it. Yeah. Well, there's a guy, the Marquis de Sade, and there's been other people like him that used to explore, and there's people in the BDSM community today, and not to make this graphic or anything, but that they explore that threshold between pain and pleasure. And they know, not knowing what's happening physiologically, but they know that as I add instruments that might intensify your pain, and then as we move towards pleasure, overall, I've actually intensified your pleasure. Well, what have I really done? To whatever degree? I've just added, by adding pain, I've added a bunch of the pleasure chemical that's still subconscious. And then when I remove the pain instruments, what's left is just pleasure.
Right.
And so we see, now that's a conscious process. Right. They're pursuing that for healing or for pleasure or for whatever the reasons are. But this is what all of us are doing unconsciously.
Right.
We are to varying degrees, depending on how dysfunctional our behavior has become, we are to varying degrees addicted to the internal heroin and unconsciously pursuing it because, and here's kind of the ironic tragedy of it all, is that so often we think that the behavior that we're choosing is behavior that takes the pain away. But invariably, it's pain. And on the surface, traditional psychology would say, oh, we're seeking to avoid pain and pursue pleasure. But that's so much less important than the unconscious pursuit of pain. And we actually know that by drinking so much that night, I'm probably going to get hungover, I'm going to be tired, my wife's going to be angry at me, and I'm going to be dealing with this tomorrow. But in the moment, based on the depth of pain that I'm in, I don't care. And so it is this dynamic that we are actually all addicted to our own internal heroin. Now, here's the tragedy also. Once you become severely addicted, you cannot get enough of the beta endorphin that your body's addicted to by pursuing pleasurable experiences that were created or developed to enhance the probability of survival. So you can tell without taking a hair test or a urine test or a blood test how addicted or dysfunctional somebody is by observing simple behaviors. To the degree that their ability to eat healthily and enjoy their food has become subverted, to the degree that their sex life has become subverted, to the degree that their sleeping patterns are subverted, to the degree that they isolate and avoid friends and that becomes stressful, to the degree that they don't even care about nature. They look at a sunset and they know they should feel something, but they feel nothing. To the degree that they have a sense of passion, purpose, or meaning, to the degree that they express and pursue their talents, well, to the degree that they do or don't do those will tell you exactly where the dopamine and beta endorphin are driving them. And so it might be driving them towards Netflix. It might be driving them towards alcohol or porn or gambling or whatever it might be, shopping online. There's no such thing as a lazy person.
And are you saying they're being driven to unconsciously find homeostasis by in this, or how does that work with, because to me, it feels so much about safety. Safety is an important word in my practice and in my, I often see myself choosing a behavior that I don't particularly want to choose, but I know that it gives me immediate sense of safety, whether it's isolation or whatever. There's a sense of, no people, thank you. You know,
right.
No complications, no more egos, no more, whatever it is that I need a break from. Can you bring that factor in?
Sure. Yeah, this is a really tricky one. You know, in traditional psychology, they have something called the repetition compulsion, where we observe these dysfunctional behaviors that just sort of go on Groundhog Day. They go on repeat. Here I am again, here I am again, here I am again. And part of that is because we believe that we're pursuing safety. We believe that we're pursuing comfort. We believe that we're pursuing something that would take my fear or pain away. And so it's very difficult to get off that hamster wheel or off that loop, because that's not true. That's not what you're pursuing. Subconsciously, you are complicit. But again, subconsciously, you are complicit in the pursuit of pain so that you could get the painkiller that you're unaware of. And so any astute observer of human behavior will watch somebody, let's say, who's struggling with depression. And they're lying on the couch and they can't get out of bed or they can't get off the couch. And they read this study saying, hey, daily exercise, just going for a walk has the same efficacy as antidepressants.
Right.
Nope, not going to do it. Eating these types of foods will intensify your depressive stresses. And then what starts to happen is they will actually unconsciously be doing things that will increase the probability that they'll stay depressed. And then depression won't be enough. They won't get enough of a biochemical reward that they're addicted to. They can't get enough of the heroin that they become addicted to. And so then the brain creates migraines, leg cramps, back pain, and we assume it's because I'm lying down so much. And so we justify the pain that's coming. But that's just so the unconscious psyche can continue to pursue more pain, because you see there's this term called chasing the dragon. You've heard the term related to people chasing their heroin addiction or their drug addiction or their alcohol addiction. But the same thing happens here. If I'm addicted to heroin and I build a tolerance, sooner or later, I'm not getting enough of the painkiller that my body's addicted to. And so I have to intensify my pain. And this is why we see people spiral down into suicidal ideation and suicide, because that cycle just doesn't stay the same. It gets worse, slowly, imperceptibly often, but it does get worse.
Okay, so when you talk about the core mechanism in the brain that helps with facilitating change as well, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about these chemicals, right?
That's right.
Is there anything else you want to say before we move to the how? Because I want to get, I'm fascinated with what you're saying, and I want to understand how you find homeostasis. How do you break these cycles? Let's move to the how.
Yeah, let me sort of speak this a little bit, and it might paint a clearer picture before we go to how. But
okay.
So there's this concept that all of these dysfunctional behaviors, all of these addictions, all of these unconscious ways of pursuing pain are potentiated initially by trauma. And now usually that trauma is going to happen early on in childhood. That can happen before that. I just worked with a client yesterday, and his trauma actually happened in utero when his mother and father decided to abort him. And obviously they didn't. And she was a Catholic lady. And at the last minute, after planning it for 2 or 3 weeks, her shame and her guilt were so overwhelming that it sort of convinced her, no, we're not going to do this. And so they ended up having the child. And then he's wondering what's wrong with him. He's wondering why he was raised by these loving parents. Well, they never told him that they were planning on aborting him. And they never told him what an incredibly challenging experience that was for them to even contemplate that for 2 or 3 weeks. Well, what we don't know what happened is that became a trauma for the infant. That became a trauma for the fetus. And so the placenta doesn't actually block the specific neuropeptides that are created neuropeptides are combinations of proteins in the hypothalamus that actually shoot throughout every cell in the body to elicit this sort of cellular consciousness and give us the feelings that we have, that we label emotions or whatever else. And so she felt so much shame and so much self-loathing as a Catholic, practicing Catholic, that the baby was actually born addicted to shame and guilt and self-loathing. And he didn't have a pronounced enough trauma in his life, as far as we could discover, that would explain the dysfunction that's sort of arisen throughout his lifetime.
So this would hold true. I know this with anxiety, that each family system, you come into the world with a certain threshold, and anything past the family's threshold of their ability to deal with anxiety is going to turn into a symptom of some sort. So you're talking about the same thing, but in this person's case, it was for shame. Yeah. And at what point, these chemicals, the two chemicals you mentioned, at what point do they begin to exist in the fetus? Is it right from the beginning? Do we know that? Because there's no thinking brain till you're 7, right? So I'm wondering if it's connected with that part of development of the brain, or if it's also when you're in that feeling part, if it exists there.
Yeah, I think we make sort of black and white assumptions about the brain. And even though I worked with a neuroscientist for 11 and a half years, and maybe I'm expert in the specific mechanisms of the model that we've developed, the brain is so incredibly complex, and we are really at the forefront of discovering what's going on in the brain. To say exactly when these things start, I think is challenging. And even to say something like that we don't have a thinking brain until 7, well, I think it's more complicated than that. Yes, there's different brainwave frequencies, and up until 6 or 7, the brain might be more in alpha or even theta, more often than it would be in beta, right? And so there's truth to that the brain is more impressionable.
And more connected. A child is more connected to feelings. Everything they think is personal. There's no separation yet. If you're serving, you said 2 forces. Well, the first force is for togetherness. That's a human force. So any parts of themselves that don't fit that's not good. Not the feeling's not good. I'm not good. So all that also impacts. So I think for me, it's an important model, because then I help people access the trauma through a feeling sense instead of just talking about it, which I don't think creates as much change. So I hear you that we can't be so specific. 7 years, this happens, and exactly.
Right. Yeah.
But that understanding when it's helpful to one's own, right? Like
and it's a generic template that typically holds true. Yeah. And so there's a specific dynamic that happens that we suggest lead people either to functionality, resilience, deeper expression of who and what they are, or the specific dynamic can actually lead in the exact opposite direction, towards pathology and dysfunction. And that is I think that there's too much emphasis on the trauma. We suggest that the trauma, even though you could measure trauma and you could see a correlation between the number and severity of trauma and then how dysfunctional people are in general, you absolutely could do that, but it's just correlated. It's not causal. And so there's a critically important missing component, and that is the attachment after the trauma. So what we say is that trauma, metaphorically, fractures the psyche. And when the psyche is fractured, essentially, to some degree, you go to survival mode. You're now in survival mode, and you must cope. And your coping mechanism will be some arbitrary automated process, typically something that you've seen that's been modeled, or something that's allowed itself to present itself in your environment. It's very, very arbitrary. And so let's say that if we consider trauma a potentiator instead of a determinant, trauma potentiates the attachment, whether it would be what we call an authentic attachment or a pseudo attachment, which would also be an addictive attachment from the perspective of our model. If you go through a trauma and you're lucky enough that you have authentic attachments exclusively, that trauma literally will make you stronger. Mm-hmm. That trauma will be a version of a rites of passage ceremony. That trauma will reveal aspects of you that will be truer to your authentic potential. And so those traumas then in situations like that, well, is it good or bad? I mean, trauma is inevitable. And so that you're lucky enough to have an authentic attachment during or after the trauma, that I guess we're going to say that's good.
And the components real quick of an authentic attachment would be, can we go through a few, like validating, being received, understood?
Yes, so those are certain types of connections that we have with other humans that are all authentic attachments. But anything that a hunter-gatherer would have attached to during our evolutionary psychology, during that sort of evolutionary process. So a hunter-gatherer could attach to nature, could attach to his band, could attach to God on some level, spirit, could attach to, again, playfulness, could attach to contribution, could attach to a variety of different things. So we've sort of listed about 25 what we call authentic attachments that were sort of inherent in the hunter-gatherer process. And to varying degrees, they have different levels of effectiveness. But there is a most important attachment.
Sorry, just one more thing about this. For different people, it could be different ones draw them, correct? In this list of 25, which is
absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
So it could be, for somebody, it could be music, it could be storytelling, it could be talking. Right. Yeah, it's just different for everybody. Yeah. Yes. And so, and then to varying degrees, all of these authentic attachments should have some effectiveness, but every person will be different how they respond to each of them.
Right.
And so if you happen to be lucky enough, well, hunter-gatherers almost exclusively had authentic attachments because that's what their environment presented as an option. That was your only option, all the things that you evolved to do. So then you would see your baby brother get eaten by a lion, and the hunter-gatherer band would respond in a certain way. Yeah. They did things very differently. They would come together and commiserate in their pain. They would wail out their pain, and a week or two later, they would celebrate the life of that person and move on in their day. And they had to, otherwise the lion's going to get the next guy. Yeah. Or they're going to fall off a cliff. And so we were compelled, but that's a part of our blueprint. That's in our operating system. And so in a modern culture, well, we're in a house with food in our fridge. We don't have to pay attention. We have this ability for mental time travel. We can project into the future or into the past. And the brain can barely tell the difference between you remembering the trauma and experiencing the trauma. So you can live the trauma over and over and over and over. And so some pretty deleterious things can happen when that experience becomes a chronic situation for you. So we have this juxtaposition, this evolutionary mismatch. We're living in an environment, we're living in a culture, and we're living in a way that our body isn't physiologically adapted to yet. And so more often than not, sadly, in the modern culture, we go through the trauma, and then we have what's called a pseudo or addictive attachment. Now, it doesn't matter that it's a pseudo or addictive attachment. If it seems to pull you out of survival mode, the psyche, the brain is still paying close attention to that. And anything now that pulls you out of survival mode must, from the perspective of the brain and the psyche, be essential for survival because it pulled you out of survival mode. So the deeper that you go into survival mode, and the more effective and the more expedited with which the process or substance it is that pulls you out of survival mode will determine how attached or addicted you are to that substance. If it's not an authentic attachment, then instantly what happens is it actually locks the trauma in the body. And then not only does it lock the trauma in the body, but you become instantly addicted to what we call the source pain emotional addictions, the feelings, the sensations. So in this case, let's just say I become addicted to shame, I become addicted to powerlessness, and I become addicted to anger. Well, that only happened because I had a pseudo addictive attachment. If I would have had an authentic attachment, I would have healed all of those, and I would have integrated the experience, and it would have made me stronger, and I would have moved forward in life with more tools. Now that I've attached to, let's say it's a bottle of booze, or let's say that it's washing my hands or having a shower. Let's say it's cleaning the bathroom. And sooner or later, whether it worked quickly or slowly, if cleaning the bathroom and cranking the music worked quickly, now I have OCD. You know what I'm saying? And so the brain just says, whether it's a bottle of alcohol, it doesn't matter that there's chemical hooks in the alcohol. What matters is that if the alcohol was the thing I took that took me out of survival mode, then the brain says alcohol critical for survival. And so every time then that you put yourself or you find yourself in a stressful situation that could be perceived as a threat on any level, then the brain goes, do the thing that saves your life, that keeps you, and boom, in that case, it's washing my hands or it's drinking alcohol or whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what we say where all dysfunction comes from, is they are pseudo false addictive attachments that actually maybe really saved my life in a modern culture, but now become the source and the perpetuation of my pain and suffering.
Mm-hmm.
So not only does these specific emotions get locked in and feelings get locked in, but what we call the compensatory attachments get locked in. So whether that's compensatory behavior or compensatory substance or compensatory identity. And so there is a most important attachment of all. And this is the determinant whether really it will be a pseudo addictive attachment or an authentic attachment. And that most important attachment of all is truth. But there is a most important version of truth, and I'm not talking subjective truth. I'm talking universal truths that we all agree upon.
The transpersonal you're talking
That's
about.
right.
Mm-hmm.
But the most important truth of all, when you go through a trauma or any sort of fracture attachment process, is understanding and believing in the truth of who you are and what you are and what you are and what you are. And so this is something that okay, we can talk about John of God or other people that have been doing these type of activities where they actually intentionally fracture the psyche. They trick you into the illusory state of survival so that they have intentions of authentic attachment, whether it's to attach to God or Christ or some other thing. It's a very powerful way for manipulating outcomes, because if you know how to fracture and attach, you can get people to attach to almost anything you want.
And if they're attaching to a person or even a philosophy in the name that person represents, that becomes their attachment. They feel better. They think it's healthy, but you're saying it's actually creating the addiction to the cult that will keep you in service of sacrificing yourself for that, because you need that, just like heroin.
You not only need it, your life depends upon it from a subconscious level.
Right.
You have to do it. And it doesn't matter that on the surface, it seems counterintuitive at best, maybe insane. And yet your body's physiology now has turned you into a puppet, because your survival is dependent on the consistent pursuit of that particular attachment.
Wow, Todd. Okay. I don't want to run out of time, and I want to move into psychedelics and the how. So again, this is so clear, and I'm sure everyone listening is going, yeah, like someone's identified with something at this point. How do you interrupt this pattern?
Beautiful question.
Cycle?
Well, it is in fact to do some version of what John of God did, except that it's way more important to not be an individual doing this, where you're seen as some sort of extension of God, somebody who's creating miracles. It's important to actually have a framework and a scalable model, so that it's a psychoeducational process that can be taught to anybody, so that you're not seen as the guru or the God. So you put inherent safeguards in place by developing a process and a model and tools that, by the very nature of your ability to incorporate and learn this information about your brain, your body, and your physiology, will actually allow you to put yourself in situations to heal yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Now that we've really empowered you.
And give us the Cole's notes, if you can, before we move to psychedelics, about this model that you developed.
Okay. So we'll call this the therapeutic model. And in a variety of different ways, we've developed over 50 different experiential type exercises with the intention of fracturing the psyche and then creating an environment of authentic attachment. So I'll give you an example, if I can, really quickly. I had a family over yesterday, and their son was with me for 2 weeks, and severe substance addiction. And also, this is actually the gentleman that was addicted to guilt and shame and self-loathing, and had no reason for it. Couldn't figure out where it came from. And just as soon as we revealed that it came in utero because of an experience that happened to his mother, it's like, oh my God, he had this odd combination of so sad for the little boy who felt so broken, but also this lightness and this relief. It's like, this explains everything. And so, okay, I invited his family over because we were going to do some version of intentionally going through the illusion of fracturing. So we want to do what we call a reverse trauma. It's not really a trauma, but it tricks the brain into thinking it's a trauma.
It's like, like a reenactment of the trauma?
It doesn't
with
have
a
to be a
different
reenactment.
ending, with a different.
Yeah, that's also intelligent. People do that, but the danger with that is that you could overstimulate somebody. So we're always looking to find a threshold. When you go through an illusory trauma or a reverse trauma and you're activating somebody, there's a bit of a gamble there, because if you go too far, you actually do re-traumatize them.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to know where that threshold is. And you have to be really acutely aware of how to intervene and have contingencies in place so that then you
Mm-hmm.
can quickly do the attachment as
Mm-hmm.
soon as you reach that threshold. So what we did is I had the individual separated from his family. His family came and he wasn't allowed to see them. He didn't know what they were going to do. He didn't know what our process was and told him nothing about it. I took him in a separate room and he could hear me talking to his family. He could hear crying. He could hear wailing. He could hear all these noises because I was taking his family through a very emotional process. And then I also had him go through a process. I had him do something what I call the funeral exercise. And what that means is that he actually had to, which everyone who was participating, he actually had to pretend that he had died because of his addiction, very specifically. And we had to meditate on that and visualize that and make it real, like a thought experiment that felt real. And then he had to actually write the eulogy for each of those people that were there in the family, but not really what they would say, but if in a perfect world, he's a ghost in the rafters and he's praying that they would say about him. And so he has to do that. Then he comes out when they're finished their work and he'll actually read. He goes behind a podium and he embodies each of those people. Okay, this is my mom. He takes a minute to meditate and become the mother and then reads what the mother wrote to him. Of course, the mother's there. So this is a fracture for everybody that's there because, now her son has died. And so they're all crying, snot, tissue, whatever, right? And he's crying uncontrollably. Well, we want that because people that are in so much pain, that are so conditioned to suffering, we need to connect them to their body and their emotions again. We need to know that they can achieve some sort of vulnerability and we want some sort of a breakdown. That's what we're going for. And so then as he was doing that, he finished reading the last person and embodying that character. And then I actually went up to him and I said to each person, he's alive, he's back, we've got another chance. Now come back, you got a fresh slate, your son's not dead, here he is. Just screaming, they came, they hugged, held him, told him how much they loved him. We would do all these things for him. And that was just the beginning. Then we did another part of the exercise, which was each of them wrote a particular type of letter that went over all of their most meaningful memories, then all of the most painful memories, and so on and so forth. Now, what ended up happening is one section of this letter is called the dirty little secret, something that I feel shame and guilt for that I've never shared with this boy. And this is where the boy learned from the mother about his impending abortion that didn't end up happening. And it transformed everything. So this is sort of like a rites of passage ceremony. We do something that's so challenging for people, and then we just swing for the fences. There's no particular type of outcome that we're measuring other than we're measuring your ability to be vulnerable and courageous and dive into the process. Mm-hmm. Then we celebrate that with the most beautiful, loving, authentic attachment afterwards. And if we can, the best authentic attachment of all is family hugging you and loving you, because it's not just you connecting to your family, it's you connecting to your worth and your value. It's you connecting to, I am loved. I'm valuable.
Like creating a new file that you didn't have before.
That's right.
In the present moment. How is what you described any different than what one would do in a cult? Because it sounds like exactly the kind of work I was doing.
Great question.
We'd have people in the dirt having their funeral because it's so powerful. So, in terms of fracturing and cracking you open, what makes the difference between a cult and what you're doing?
It's a good question. I think to have a framework and a model so that it's completely transparent, so everybody understands what you're doing and they understand the inherent risk in what you're doing. And also, you're not the guru or the leader.
Right.
The risk of having a guru or a leader is just, we're so vulnerable for that. When you want to talk about becoming addicted, well, all the little fracture attachments that some guru or cult leader would become so severely addicted to the seduction, to the pain, to the manipulation, to all of the things that he could or she could impart upon the people that are participating in the cult. But I will have to say this in good conscience. I've actually had several people say to me that you're charismatic, you're well-spoken, and you're doing stuff like you really, like, let's say they watched a movie. They say, oh my God, you could be a cult leader. Like, you have all the characteristics and traits. Well, what's the difference? Well, you've got this model, and we can see, and actually you can process your behavior through your own model. You can see if it's become subverted.
And is this always group work when you're working with people, or can it be done individually?
Yeah, it can be done both ways. I find my most powerful exercises often are work. I mean, group related.
Group work, yeah.
Yeah.
Because the shame is amped up. You've got witnesses. Everyone's replicating a part of your family system. That's right. So powerful.
Yeah. And the vulnerability, the unpredictability, the uncertainty, you're intensified. Now, I can do that individually. It just takes me a little longer to prep. It takes me a little longer to prepare the individual to create that level of excitement. Now, what John of God would do is he would lean you up against a wall. This is just one of the things that he did. And he would take a hammer and a nail, and the nail was certain length, and he would put it in your nasal cavity and drive it in with the nail, with the hammer. But it was not long enough to pierce and go into past the nasal cavity into the brain. But you're just seeing this hammer come and driving this nail into your head. And so instantly that fractures the psyche. That's all it takes, is anything that will push you to the edge like that. And then he knew that I would take you in another room, and I would start to pray with you, and I would start to talk about God and Okay. Let's talk briefly about then how I can do this with psychedelics. Now, that's easier for me to deal with one person, because the psychedelics will actually do in a very short period of time what the nail would do, or what the 2-day preparation group workshop exercise would do.
All right. And include what's happening in the brain when you introduce it, and why psilocybin, because I'm assuming it's psilocybin. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I think our number one medicine is psilocybin.
Okay.
We also use MDMA, and MDMA is for people that, let's just say, their anxiety or their trauma or their PTSD is so severe that it's just too difficult for them to even submit or surrender to the psilocybin process.
Okay.
And then we also work a lot with DMT. So DMT, inherent advantages, of course, disadvantages and advantages as far as we can tell. The disadvantage is the incredible abstraction of the experience. This is so difficult for you to make sense of, but it doesn't really matter, because it still fractures the psyche, and you can do authentic attachment. Even if the medicine itself didn't give you a clear message, we know how to anchor and integrate in a way after the use of the medicine, so that we can still go through process and have you attached to the most important authentic attachments, even if it's just one-on-one. And so the advantage of DMT is that experience might be anywhere from 5 to 25 minutes. So it's very quick, it's expedited, and still very effective. And they're doing a lot of research on DMT now, and it looks like efficacies are coming in maybe around or just a little bit below what they're doing with psilocybin, but still remarkable, just really, really, really positive. So, but the number one medicine that we use is psilocybin. I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One, that a lot of these psychedelics are shamanic traditions. Peyote, ayahuasca, ibogaine, these different medicines. I don't know if they're better facilitated by shaman, but I didn't really want to get into the shamanic realm. I'm not trained as a shaman for 10 years. I want to say this with a real sense of humility, but also caution. As more and more Westerners are being exposed to these shamanic traditions, they don't have a reference. They don't have a sensibility. They don't have a history with the language, with the medicine, with an understanding of the culture that has been doing these things for thousands of years. And some of the research is pointing to that these people are coming back. A lot of them, still the majority, there's inherent wisdom, it seems, in the plant. And that inherent wisdom imparts and extols its virtues and its knowledge upon the individual, where they have these profound experiences and these epiphanies and whatever you want to call it, that they can carry home, and those would be their authentic attachments. But too many people now, it seems, are left fractured.
Right.
Coming home in this state of just floundering and not knowing what to do with it, not knowing what happened to them. And in fact, if you understand the model, it's quite dangerous for them, because if they go back to their old egoic way, if they go back to their old modus operandi and turn back to the old addictions, the old beliefs, it can actually deepen the dysfunctional addictions and beliefs, because they're so fractured. And so to do this in a productive and healthy and safe way, I think is really, really important. And so now we've developed a training model where we certify plant medicine facilitators. And it's a weekend intensive where they come in and they learn the first day. The first 8 hours is all about learning about this core mechanism, a little bit more about the brain, so on and so forth. The second day is really geared towards the implementation. How do we integrate the knowing of the model and the particular nuances and unique aspects of the model into the application of plant medicine? And then we follow up with 2 Zoom calls a month for the next 6 months at an hour at a time, where we add more layers, more understanding, more specificity. And then there's a 150-page workbook that they have to do. Then there's a 70-hour online course that they have to do. And then there's the specific reverse trauma healing modality booklet that they have to study. And then they do a 3-ceremony practicum where they don't get paid. They're just there assisting, observing, assisting. And then on the third, they step into role and we assist them. Then they do a pretty intensive final exam. And the final exam is an open book final exam. In fact, they could even call me up and ask me questions about it. I just need to know, we need to know that they're going to know all of the information and get things right.
So you know what is occurring to me is we dove in to the beginning so succinctly. I don't want to rush over this. I'm going to suggest that we have you back and do another hour specifically looking at first of all, how you realize what the benefit is of psychedelics to the work that we're talking about and breaking that pattern, really unpack that, but also how you design this program. And so people can hear, like, is this right for me? Because they're drawn to it, or perhaps they don't know much about it. But I think we can really talk more specifically rather than just racing through it. How would that feel?
You got that sense that I was starting to speed up, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. I could feel that. But, and it's so interesting, and it's so important, because the ethics, we haven't even used the word ethics yet, but understanding, that's why we talked about cults and how people then attribute, whether it's to a shaman or to a person, giving away that power cannot ever lead to healthy attachment in any way, shape, or form. Nope. So I want to really unpack this, because there's such a movement, such a renaissance in the field of psychedelics, and it can be abused so easily, and has been and is being abused. So what do you think, Todd? Will you come back for another hour? We're going to specifically, we've laid the groundwork. This will be part 2.
Yeah, I love it. I love it.
Okay.
For sure.
So we're still going to have all this information about, if people hear this and they want to know a little bit more about the work you're doing, it's all on consciouslavingradio.org. Links to you will be there. I wonder, just to wrap up today, let me ask you from your heart, just in this present moment, what it is. We're talking about something that is so, everyone wrestles on some level with wanting to be at peace, with wanting to be connected. Yeah. What would be your invitation to kind of inspire our listeners to hang in there and maybe, and come back and join us the next time we do this? Do we know when it will be, Mark? No, we don't yet, but we'll keep you all posted.
Well, we can book it almost next week if we really choose to.
That would give people,
great.
I have to.
Well, I love momentum. We're in a good place, and we can, we got VIF coming up as well, but it's nice to just have things ready for air.
Okay.
Beautiful. Yeah, I'm down for that.
But your heart, let's have your heart talk, Todd, just to wrap us up here.
Yeah. Okay. So, I have been touched in some way moved in some way, motivated in some way, that I observe the suffering of humanity. And knowing what I know, when I say suffering, what I mean is not the removal of pain. Pain is necessary. In fact, pain is your best friend. Pain is an incredible teacher. Pain is a vital part of our human experience. It is, in fact, these repetitive patterns of pain that we get stuck in that become our suffering. And I would call suffering unnecessary pain, even though you could argue that some suffering is useful. There's still learning in that, subtlety and nuance. But just as a general rule, I would say suffering is unnecessary pain. And I'm so acutely aware of human suffering, and it's unnecessary. So we are being lifted. We are at sort of this fork in the road where I think we come into a better version of consciousness individually and collectively, and the world changes. Or we keep on the path of fear and greed and disconnect and control and violence and pain. And inevitably, I don't think that the world can sustain this. I mean, I'm not saying 10 years from now or whatever, but there is a predictable outcome. And so we have to shift. Mm-hmm. And I would just like this model, not myself specifically, I don't care about it, but I'd like the model to be accepted so that people can understand there's a new way of looking at the world. And if I could break it down as a final sentence, I would say that all forms of chronic and dysfunctional patterns of pain are perpetuated by an inability or a lack of commitment to experience and tell truth. And if your model is some sort of a framework that allows you to delineate better, differentiate better truth from falsity, that so many forms of dysfunction will just end up disappearing. Mm-hmm. On our next show, remind me to talk to you about specifically cortisol and the chemicals that we can measure that will predict outcomes and are causal and so on and so forth, and some of the work that we're doing around that.
Lovely. Okay, I'm excited. I want to keep going with this. And for me, the next show too, I want to dive into bring in some more of the spiritual, because whatever that means, not the dogma, but whatever spirituality means to each person, and how that, because I think that's that's certainly with plant medicines where the identity is not I. There is a we-ness of any invitation to a plant medicine that's unavoidable, because it is a mycelium network, right? Yeah. As are we. And so, I've loved talking with you. Thank you for joining us. We'll do this again next week, and we'll hear more about your training, more about cortisol and how suffering is unnecessary. So make sure you tune in. Thanks, Todd, for joining us.
All right,
been listening to Conscious Living Radio 100.5 FM in Vancouver, Co-op Radio, and